He lived in a house that could have held a loud, bustling family, and instead had become a museum of absence. The table was wide enough for guests, and yet every evening a single plate sat in front of the same chair. A child's tiny shoes gathered dust in the corner. Doors that led to rooms once full of life remained closed, their knobs untouched, as if touching them might disturb the air inside and let in something he could not bear. Antônio Ferreira kept the house like a promise he would not break to the past. He walked the veranda every morning with a thermos of coffee, looking over the coffee rows as if the act of measuring the plant's growth could replace the rhythms he had lost. The estate was generous: green hills, a narrow lane of cedars, the small white chapel at the top of the hill where Laura's grave waited beneath a stone carved by hands that had known grief. Yet the more the land produced, the less of it made its way into his life. He had become careful against any noise that might threaten the silence he had built. 8 years had a strange weight, the days stacked like the wooden boxes he used for the harvest, precise, uniform, and heavy after a time. 8 years since the accident that took Laura and Miguel, an intersection on a rainy night, a truck that did not stop. He did not speak of the details much. The town already had the story and the reverence for it. What remained were the small things. Miguel's small red truck tucked beneath the bed where no one played, Laura's jars of dried herbs lined up in the pantry, a single rose bush that stubbornly came back every spring beneath the kitchen window, its blooms as if offering forgiveness in pink and white. Dona Creusa, who had been with the family before most people remembered, kept watch over the house like a tender sentinel. She prepared the same meals, folded the same linens, and when the weather turned cold, she would lay another blanket on Antonio's bed, with a tenderness that sometimes made his throat catch. João, the foreman, tended the coffee plantings and handled the accounts, his practical presence enough to keep the farm solvent. People invited him to church suppers, to card games, to neighborhood gatherings. He declined. Invitations became letters of concern. Concern became gossip for some, pity for others. Antonio grew used to the silence of plates in rooms. The first sign that something would break that stillness was a thin thread of smoke, and the way it climbed unnatural into the morning sky. It was late in a dry season. The earth had the brittle sound of paper when you trod on it, when the neighbor's small parcel of land caught. Antonio heard the crack like a long sigh through the wall. He was 2 steps onto the veranda before he knew why he was moving. The reflex to run toward danger had been a different kind of muscle he had not used in years, but that remembered itself when called. By the time he reached the lane, the air smelled of something old and raw. Smoke blurred the rows of coffee trees, turning the world into a watercolor of gray. The neighbor's shed was a sinkhole of flames. A dog barked from a safe distance. A boy from 2 houses down stood with his hands over his mouth. Antonio did not know the people who had bought the property last month. The place had been empty and then alive with promise of someone starting anew. Now it was a strip of desperate orange. He crossed the field without thinking about trespass or ownership. The heat hit him like the hand of someone he had loved and lost years ago. Bright, immediate, impossible to argue with. Someone moved inside the smoke, a figure beating at a window, and Antonio's legs and lungs and old reflexes took him forward. He did not remember thinking heroic thoughts. He only remembered acting. Ash fell on his shoulders like a mantle, and when he stepped into the doorway the smell of burning wood and fabric closed over him. He found her on the dirt floor, coughing, a shawl over her hair, eyes burning. She was not young, maybe in her 40s, but there was a rawness in her that made time sharp around her edges. Hands rough from work, streaks of soot on her cheek, a steadiness in the way she set her jaw. She was half lifted by the smoke when Antonio grabbed her wrist and pulled her out into the open air. They lay on the grass like 2 people who had been given a reprieve by a thin margin. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The townspeople gathered on the road, their faces half formed through the smoke. Someone offered a blanket, someone else called for water. A child beside the ditch craned his neck to see who the woman was, eyes wide. She coughed until her lungs were clear, and then, with the kind of straightness that takes the edge off pity, she looked at him directly. Her voice was gravelled from smoke, but the words cut through like a slate dropped into still water. "Do you fear loving again, or losing again?" The question was simple, almost like a tool handed to him, yet it lodged like a splinter beneath practices he had taught himself for years. He had been asked similar questions in different forms. Why shut the house? Why refuse the church potlucks? But she had not asked why he refused. She forced the choice. Was he protecting his heart from the risk of loving, or protecting it from the risk of losing? There was no room in the question for noble suffering. It only offered two names for a single thing: fear. He did not answer immediately. He was a man who had put his conversations into routines, into the tending of trees and the careful measuring of beans. Words rustled into place like leaves. He held the woman's gaze until the soot on her shoulder caught the late sun and glinted. "I used to know both," he said finally, the sound low and more like a confession to himself than an explanation. "But I'm not sure which is which anymore." She pressed her fingers into his arm, not in a way that would have been familiar in closer acquaintance, but in a way that marked him as solidly present. "Then start with what you can," she said. "Lift, fix a corner, let the light back in." It was not a challenge exactly, it was an instruction given to someone also half made of dust. That day he found himself offering her a cup of coffee in his kitchen, hands that had once made coffee for another now making it for a stranger. She drank, and then asked if she could stay until she had sorted out the insurance with the neighbors or arranged some work. He found himself saying, in a voice that surprised him with its softness, "Yes." After the first block of hours, as the smoke thinned and the sun pulled clarity back into the world, Antonio walked the stranger down the path to the house his family had once animated. The door opened like an instrument of memory. Items lay where they had been left 8 years ago: a scarf on a peg, a child's drawing on the refrigerator, a stack of unpaid bills that Donna Creusa had kept within reach. She looked around without flinching. Her name, when she said it, was Clara Mendez. They talked in small measures at first. She spoke of the shed that had been her life: chickens, a few vegetable beds, a small plot of coffee she had been tending since she moved into the parcel. She talked about the man she had been married to, Ricardo, with a pause that carried weight heavier than any adjective could. He had been a gambler who found his refuge in the clink of dice and the bright promise of quick money. When the losses stacked, they made their own terrible calculus. In the end, the thing that had been a problem became final. "He was gone," she said softly, which held more than the facts. She did not beg or make herself small. She prepared food, swept the yields of the morning, and when she laughed it was quick, practical, like a strike of sunlight through clouds. Antonio listened. He offered small comforts, more out of muscle memory than intention: a bowl of soup, a dry towel, a change of clothes. As dusk pulled down the hills, they stood on the veranda, and the town around them seemed to exhale. For the first time in years, the house filled with another's presence. If stories of second chances move you, consider subscribing. The request came to his mind like an odd echo of modern life, a small interruption to a quiet day. It was not the voice of the town, or even of the people gathered around the fire. It was his own private sense that this moment was the turning of a page, and that if anyone else wanted to see how a man could rebuild a life, they might follow along. He shook his head gently and returned to the cup of coffee warming his hands. Clara settled into a corner of the house that seemed to serve as a temporary holding pen for other people's lives. She kept to herself but did not isolate. She rose with the sun and walked the coffee rows with João, who took a quick liking to her because of the way she checked the plants with a farmer's eye and a woman's careful hand. They put out new doves' nests, patched a torn roof on one of the sheds, and argued good-naturedly over the best time to prune. Antonio watched the rhythms return to his place. It was not dramatic, there were no great speeches. It was the gradual reintroduction of voices into rooms that had been silent for too long. There were the small intimacies that come when two people share work. A hand offered to hold a beam while the other tightened a bolt. A shared thermos while mending a fence. Clara wiping his forehead when a stubborn splinter found him. Her presence pushed and pulled the old habits. He found himself opening a window in Miguel's old room to let in the air. He let a sunbeam land on the dust where a child's toys waited, and for a moment he imagined the noise of a child's voice making reel the small truck on the floor. They spoke of grief like two people picking at a stubborn knot in cloth. He told her about Laura, how she kept a notebook of recipes, how she pressed dry grass between the pages of a book of psalms. He spoke of Miguel in short bursts. The way his knees were always bruised from a fall, his persistent curiosity that made him lean too close to things he shouldn't. Clara did not pry. She told him, in pieces, about nights she had sat in a small back room with a radio humming while Ricardo went out, and the way shame had built itself like a wall between them. She confessed to little things, moments of swallowing her hunger rather than share it, the practice of keeping light bills unpaid until they were envelopes marked by red. The way she ended sentences was sometimes careful, the way someone handles a cleaving knife, precise. The town watched the change with a mixture of hope and a dangerous hunger for stories. People whispered when Clara showed at church or when she carried bundles of cuttings from Laura's rosebush to plant in her own corner. Some took comfort in the sight of Antonio smiling again in faint ways. He did not marry smiles to meaning yet. He measured gestures, the ease with which he handed her a plate, the way his voice lost its edge when she came near. Leonore watched with a different eye. She had lived on the lane for as long as anyone could recall, and had the kind of small dominion that comes from always being present in other people's business. Her face folded into expressions the town read like weather. She asked questions not because she sought answers, but because questions are the instruments of rumor. At the market she would mention Clara's name with a lift of her chin, her tone a soft bell of doubt. "You know what people say," she would say, half turning the statement into gossip. "A new woman comes into a house, and one always wonders." Sometimes her words were like raindrops that slowly widened a crack in the soil. Not everyone listened. João shrugged off the whispers the way one might brush leaves from a path. Dona Crosa, who had seen a dozen seasons of loss and love, offered Clara clothes that had once belonged to Laura, folded carefully as though passing the mantle rather than replacing it. She would press her palm to Antonio's arm and say, "He is old enough to have warmth back," without hinting at anything the rest of the town might want to pronounce on. The months that followed set a steady, modest rhythm. They repaired a buttressed fence, built a small lean-to for Clara's salvaged chickens, and cleared what remained of the burned patch to replant seedlings. The physical labor was its own kind of therapy. Calluses opening, splinters removed, plans made for next season's crop. All practical things that wear grief down slowly, because moving a post requires presence of mind and muscle. The land expected nothing but constancy. In delivering on that expectation, Antonio found the first honest moments of a life beyond the house's shadow. One afternoon, while both were kneeling in the rosebed that had been Laura's small ornamental garden, Clara stopped and picked up a rose whose petals had already started to soften. She held it in both hands like a relic and handed it to Antonio without words. He looked at it, then at her. "You didn't have to," he began, but she placed a finger gently on his lips. "It is not yours to keep," she said. "It is yours to share." The phrase lodged because it was both simple and revolutionary for him. To share a thing was to risk that it would be altered by someone else's owning of it. He had spent years protecting his memories by putting them under glass and telling himself that preservation was the same thing as honoring. She, by contrast, asked not to preserve but to replant. She wanted the rosebush's offspring to go into the new lean-to, to mingle with her own cuttings as if their pasts could make a new thing. It was not a theatrical moment. There was no swell of music or grand confession. It was a hand given to receive a flower, an ordinary exchange that slowly reoriented him. The roses, more than any sermon or neighborly counsel, began to teach him that memory could be honored without being barricaded. At night, he would walk to the chapel where Laura rested. The hill was cool, and the path smelled of damp soil and citrus leaves. He would stand before her stone and speak out of habit. "I keep things as you like them." Sometimes he asked for small counsel from a past he had sealed off from living people. That night, his question returned to him, the woman's earlier, honest provocation that had thrown a life raft to him and expected him to climb upon it. Fear of loving again or fear of losing again? He had answered inconclusively when she asked, but in the quiet of the cemetery the question unspooled a second time, longer. Was he withholding love because he thought to protect himself from a new fissure of pain, or had his grief become something he preferred to the risk required to let someone new in? There was no moral calculus he could apply. Grief, he had learned, was not a teacher in a linear sense. It taught and it punished in equal measure. Yet there, with the stone pressed under his hand, he felt its weight differently. The idea that he might make a choice between guarding and living felt for the first time like a choice one could make. In the weeks that followed, the town's gossip became more audible. Leonore did not shout it, she polished it like a mirror, and passed it to friends so they might admire it somewhat privately. "Did you hear about that woman?" she would ask, carefully casual. The sentences were always incomplete, leaving the space where speculation might grow like a mold in damp dishes. At the bakery, an elderly woman would swear she saw a man meeting Clara late in the afternoon. At the river, a group of women would lean on a fence and discuss the way debt collectors had come and gone in other parts of the county. Rumors serve as medicine in some places. They are prescribed to explain what people do not understand. And they can be poison in a small community where reputation is the currency of everyday life. Antonio noticed the glances. He felt them like small blows because they made the life he was quietly building feel suddenly tentative. He had always imagined that grief would mark him with a badge and spare him the more dangerous elements of community scrutiny. Instead, the badge became a target. People who had once respected his distance now tilted toward a more particular curiosity. Would he choose to step into a new life or retreat into the old? In the afternoons, Clara would come into the kitchen and sit by the window, where Laura once pressed her palms to wipe steam from the glass. She would hand Antonio a cup, and sometimes they sat in silence with the radio playing something thin and country, a voice talking about a harvest or a world beyond their lane. Other times she told him about a woman in the next town who had turned misfortune into a small shop, or about a cousin who had left to the city and sent back cloth. Her voice was practical and tethered to the earth. She did not demand explanations for the pauses that came in his sentences. She accepted them as the weather passed. The seasons shifted. The first rains came, and the coffee plants breathed. The scarred earth that had held the neighbor's burning patch began to show small green shoots, where Clara had insisted they sow certain resilient seeds. João laughed one morning at how insistently Clara had arranged seed rows, calling them her own brand of stubbornness. Antonio felt that laugh like an offering. It warmed him in places that had been numb for a long time. Yet with warmth also came the small edges of unease. One Sunday at church, a cluster of women left the pew prior to the final hymn, and their conversation reached Antonio's ears without being intentionally delivered. She did not tell them everything, did she? It is strange to have someone move in with so much left unsaid. The shape of the words did not accuse directly, but they were enough to set ants into his skin. He had not the grace to confront them then. Instead, he drew closer to the pew back and touched the wood where Laura had once rested her hand. A few nights later, Antonio found a letter stacked on the table in the small common room near the road, a piece of paper with neat handwriting that was not his, delivered without fanfare and left as if it were an afterthought. No seal, no envelope. Inside were 2 sentences. People had noticed inquiries about debts, and a neighbor had a question about Clara's past. It was signed only with a name he knew too well, Leonore. The note did not accuse in legal terms. It instead offered the suggestion of impropriety, like a seed you plant in someone else's field and wait to see if it will take root. Antonio folded the paper twice and tucked it into his shirt, near his heart. He did not confront Leonore that evening. He set the paper aside in a drawer next to the old farmer's ledger, where unpaid bills and the town's collection notices meshed into the dust of ordinary life. That night, Clara came to him and sat in the chair across from his, where for years no one had sat. She had been working until late, sweeping the last of the ash from the new coop they had built together. Her hands were still rough, her wrists smudged with the day's work. "Do you know what she's doing?" she asked, not looking at Leonore but at the place where his hands folded together in his lap. He shook his head. He felt something like shame for carrying the little letter like contraband. "Someone left a note," he said. "Leonore's name on it? She suggests people are talking." Clara did not stiffen in anger. Instead, she folded her hands over her knees and let out a small breath. "People will talk," she said, as if this were a weather pattern. "We can't make them stop. We can only make our own work so honest that it outshouts the gossip." Her response was an exact echo of the very thing she had told him when they first met. "Start with what you can." He wanted to believe it. He wanted to take her hand and fold himself into the practical certainty of the work. But standing there, with the shadow of Laura's chair in the next room, he felt the old fear like a cold place at the base of his neck. Was he about to erect again a hedge to keep out pain? Or was he finally learning to open a gate? That question, do you fear loving again or losing again, rose to the surface now with the force of someone who had been tested. He had been offered a life raft twice, once in the hands of memory and ceremony, and once in the hands of a woman from a burned field who insisted on getting up and making a home. Which would he choose? Which would he refuse? He did not choose that night, not in any final way. He asked only small, steady questions. He asked Clara about a childhood memory, about the way she had learned to mend a roof, about the song she hummed when she worked. She answered without melodrama and without the burden of self-defense. There were gaps in her account of the last years with Ricardo, spaces where she said only, "It was hard," and then shifted to the practical details of feeding the chickens. There were performances of grief in her voice, not the theatrical kind, but the honest kind that belongs to people who have been pressed. A month later, at the community hospitality night, when the lane gathered to celebrate the end of the harvest, Leonore took her sly craft further. She found a conversation partner in a man who dealt with papers and compliance, a casual messenger at first glance. They sat near the punch bowl and spoke of small debts the way people speak weather. Their voices were designed for public ears, carefully loud enough to be overheard. Antonio caught the cadence without meaning to. A mention of a past spouse, a phrasing about some unresolved affairs in a neighboring parish. It was designed to germinate. It was the sort of politics that feeds on worry. He left the gathering early. He walked home under a sky smudged with stars, and his steps took him in the direction of the chapel more than toward the warm bed he had lately shared in company. The road up the hill seemed longer than he remembered. He thought, not for the first time, and certainly not for the last, of the two choices the woman had put before him that afternoon in smoke and ash. Would he live to love again, or would he live to keep from losing again? The small plants on the burned patch were pushing up like tentative flags of determination. The roses had thrown a new bloom. He could not say exactly what grief demanded from him now, abstention or risk. When he reached the top of the hill, the moon was a thin coin above Laura's stone. He placed his hand upon the stone as he had many times before and said, in the same quiet voice he used to speak to his dead son, "I am trying to be honest now." He did not know what being honest would cost him. He only knew that for the first time in years, the house behind him did not feel like a cage so much as the threshold it had always been. A place where a person could enter in and take leave, where memories might dwell without barricading the future. Down in the lane, the murmur of Leonore's shadow gathered force. The town was a living thing, and it breathed through the mouths of its people. Rumor moves like root water, unseen but powerful. In the kitchen, Donna Creusa lit a lamp and sewed a hem with the steady hand of those who have made small acts of care into a life. João shut the barn and hummed a tune that had no particular meaning. Clara, in her little corner, left a cup to dry on the counter and then folded her hands. None of them knew what the next day would bring. They only knew they had to face it together. Antonio walked back down the hill and paused by the rose bush, its flowers smelling faintly of Laura's hands. Clara was there at the porch steps, sleeves pushed up, dirt under her nails like a testimony. She looked up as he approached, and she did not ask if he had heard. She only offered a small, unadorned smile, as if all the questions of the town were extraneous beside the fact that tonight there was a bowl to wash and a roof to patch, and a patch of earth that needed tending at dawn. He took her hand for a moment. It was not a promise and not a contract. It was a small, dangerous decision to touch another human being and to hold for a second what that contact might produce. The question the night had asked him, "Do you fear loving again or losing again?" hung there like a star that had yet to be named. He squeezed her fingers once and let go. They stood there in the gentle dark, two people who had lost in different ways, who had moved back toward each other with the cautious hope of people who have learned that life is not a single act, but a series of small redos. The land around them breathed, and the house, which had been a museum for years, hummed with the possibility of becoming a home. It would not be easy. The town's whispers gathered, and with them a series of small, unavoidable tests. But at the moment, in the hush before whatever would come next, Antonio felt something he had not felt in a very long time, a readiness to risk. The rosebush's scent rode the air, and he turned his face up to it, as if inhaling was not merely about oxygen, but a commentary on the courage it takes to try again. The note in the drawer sat like a bruise. For days after Antonio found it, he would lift the lid of the old ledger and let his fingers rest on the folded paper, as if feeling for anything that might still pulse under the skin. The town continued its small orbit of chores. Cattle needed watching, months needed planning, and the coffee trees answered only to the slow weather. Yet the seed that Leonor had planted, suggestion dressed as concern, began to take root in the shallow places he had left for other people's judgments. It started with looks, then moved to half-words. A man at the feed mill glanced at him longer than necessary. A neighbor who once greeted him with a nod now coughed an aside about how quickly some people rebuilt. Leonor herself kept a kind of practiced innocence. She came by to borrow sugar and stayed long enough to let the smallest hint of venom sit on the table. "I only say what others think," she told Antonio once, as if confession absolved gossip. Her voice had the calm of someone convinced that she was protecting the lane from impropriety. Antonio tried to displace the buzzing by work. If he measured the rows and checked the irrigation, the rest of his mind quieted. He chose for a time to watch more than speak. He watched Clara, who had stepped into his kitchen and into his life with no ceremony, as she moved through the day. She rose early, fed her chickens, patched a roof, cleaned a clog, and came to him with practical questions about seed spacing that João found refreshingly direct. She did not ask for pity, and perhaps that was why she made him comfortable in a way no one had for years. Pity suggested finality, and she refused to let her history be the only thing that defined her. Then one morning, as the rains made mud of the lane, Dr. Morel arrived with a neat leather folder tucked under his arm. He was a man who wore precision like a habit. His suit was never ruffled, his shoes always shone. He had been the town's lawyer longer than most could remember, someone who had settled disputes over fences and wills, and the quiet business of transferring land. When he knocked at Antonio's door, there was a weight to the knock that suggested his visit had been planned. "Antonio," he said when the man opened the door, voice even, "may I come in?" Inside the house the light held motes over the dining table, and the single chair was no longer the only place anyone sat. Antonio showed Morels to the small common room and poured coffee the way he had done for strangers and friends for decades. The lawyer had come on routine business, he said at first. He read the room with an economy of words that made Antonio feel like something private had been catalogued. Then Morels opened the folder. It contained papers, statements, a few lists of names, a ledger that looked not unlike Antonio's own, and an insurance form with handwriting that looped in a way wanting explanation. "We have received inquiries," Morels said. Someone flagged possible omissions in the disclosure forms relating to the parcel Clara bought, and there are questions regarding debts tied to her late husband. We thought it right to inform you, given your involvement in helping her. Antonio's chest tightened. He had not thought of himself as legally involved. He had offered shelter and work, and in return, Clara had dusted his furniture, mended his fences, and learned the cadence of his land. But the presence of formal papers had the effect of turning warm life into ledger lines. The suggestion, no matter how careful Morel's phrasing, was that the woman he had been growing fond of had omissions stacked like bills waiting to be paid. He took the papers with hands that did not completely belong to him. When he looked at the printed lists, small details jumped at him. An account number here, a name he half recognized there, a phrase about outstanding obligations that read like an accusation. The ledger pages were not dramatic, they were plain. But that plainness made them feel judicial. Leonor, who had not carried the folder in person but whose whispers had urged the situation into motion, would later say she only wanted the community to be informed. But for Antonio the folder was a test, and like any test in a small town, it sought to make private choices public. He did not confront Clara with the papers. He could have. He had taken her into his home and his life and owed her, at the least, the dignity of truth. Instead, something older and less honorable took him by the hand. Fear dressed as caution. He folded the folder back into his jacket, placed it in the drawer where the note from Leonor sat, and found that the room felt suddenly narrower. After that, the pattern was quiet but unmistakable. He left earlier for the fields and came home later. Invitations from neighbors were answered with weary letters. Where once there had been a small light of willingness in his expression when she stood nearby, there was now a shut line, Clara noticed, and she met his reserve with patience she tried to make unshowy. But behind that patience yawned a worry that had form, the worry that he might believe the town's malice rather than the woman who had rebuilt a burned coop and carried a pot of stew to his table. Word of the ledger and the lawyer's visit traveled as rumors do, staccato pieces assembled into a larger pattern that rarely matched the whole truth. Leonore's name found new lodgings in conversations. People who previously had no interest in Clara began to imagine stories for themselves. Some said she had hidden the truth to gain sympathy and secure a place in town. Others whispered that perhaps she had been running from more than debt. Perhaps shame had driven her from one life to another. The virulent power of such narratives is the way they turn complexity into an easy object. Antonio, who had in the past been careful with what he allowed to shape him, now felt stories made by other people's wants move him without his consent. One afternoon, when the sky had the flat white of pre-storm, Clara came into the kitchen with a bruise round her eye. She had slipped on the ladder while mending the henhouse and tried to laugh it off, but that did not hold. Her lips tightened as she set down the kettle. "It will bruise, then be gone," she said, and she reached for a cloth. Her voice was practical, but the smallness of the sound did not hide that she was bruised in a way that was deeper than skin. Antonio watched her and felt a coldness spread through him he could not claim. He thought of the papers and of how much he had already let other people's words move him. He had, in some fashion, retreated. He had let fear do what grief had not done alone. His heart, which had risked the tiniest hope at her hand, now drew back into a shell he recognized, the same shell that had kept Miguel's toys undisturbed and Laura's jars untouched. When he next saw Leonore, he did not speak of the papers. She, with the cunning of someone used to being arbiter, told him how difficult it was to be the one who carried concerns. "Someone has to," she said. "I told them it's only our place to look after each other." Antonio had the sense that he had been placed in a second grave, one not of earth but of suspicion. He returned home, folded the note and the folder into his pocket as if they were reliquaries, and sat for a long time in the chair he had not sat in alone for 8 years. He felt the world of his land, a world of coffee dirt and early sun, grow strange and brittle. Clara, meanwhile, did not intensify her appeals or respond with bitterness. She continued to wake early, to whistle a small tune while pulling weeds, to feed her birds. Yet small signs of wear showed themselves. She lost weight, she laughed less. The ache of being suspected hovered around her like a fog. She stopped going to the market as often, and when she did, she carried her head lower. A neighbor once handed her a sack of flour, and she took it like a woman who had learned to take what was offered without expectation. Donna Creusa watched her with an eye that saw more than anyone else. When the house emptied, Creusa sat beside Clara and mended clothes with bare hands and with a tenderness that was neither intrusive nor theatrical. Creusa's presence resembled the kind of steadying mercy that rural lives often need, small, persistent, patient. One night there was a knock at the door. Antonio opened it and found Clara standing there, rain streaking her hair, face hollowed with a decision. "He says he can help," she said without preamble. "A man named from the town in the next county. He says he might be able to fix a few things if I let him take care of just one more payment." She paused. The sentence trembled between her and the small kitchen table. Antonio could see the past in that tremble, the times she had swallowed hunger rather than speak of bills, the nights she had sat by a radio, the choices made under pressure when there seemed to be no other way. He thought of the folder in his drawer, and for a moment, in the coldness that had become easier to wear than warmth, he took that hesitation as a reason to say no to her altogether. "Don't," he said quietly. Clara's face buckled, but she did not collapse. "Antonio," she pleaded, "just tell me yes. I need one more night of trust. I need—" He shut the sentence down with his fingers. "I can't," he said. "Not now." She stood there, rain on her sleeves, caught between exhaustion and the stubbornness that had kept her building a new life after a flame had taken so much. In the silence that followed, he saw in her a small human figure trying to hold together the remnants of dignity. He thought of the papers. imagined the ledger lines as a snare, and thought only of protecting himself from a risk he thought might come. He did not yet admit that he was protecting himself from a fear that had little to do with Clara, and everything to do with the city of absence where he had lived for 8 years. She left without breaking. Antonio watched her go down the lane, shoulders set, a small figure carrying the weather. He sank into the chair beside the table and felt the house press in. He had chosen safety. He had chosen the known temperature of grief over the risk of new pain. The decision, once made, settled in his body like sediment. That night, Clara did not sleep. She walked the small patch of land she had begun to call hers, checked her chickens, and then returned to the empty shed the fire had left and sat among the charred beams. The rain had left the smell of old wood and of iron where nails had been. She lit a small candle and folded her hands around it as if collecting warmth. The ledger lines in the lawyer's folder were a map to shame she had been trying to avoid. Her silence had been a form of self-protection she believed necessary for the sake of the dignity she had left. Her decision to stop asking Antonio for help in the way she had asked struck her down. Months later, when she was found collapsed on the floor of the shed by a boy who had gone to fetch eggs, the town's breath shortened. He ran for help, and João reached her first, on his knees with a cloth and whispering a name like a prayer. Antonio, who had been in his office trying to reconcile a shipment of beans, heard the commotion and felt, like a physical blow, the knowledge that Clara, the woman whose question had pried a door in him, was now at risk. From that point, the narrative of the town gathered pace. Clara was taken to the hospital in the nearest town, a ride that felt for Antonio like a piece of his own heart being carried away. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and lemon. Fluorescent lights made the waiting room feel like another cold sky. Everyone who had once whispered in the lane now spoke in softer tones and with guilt stitched into their voices. Leonor came by the door and said something about how fragile life was, while smoothing her apron as if guilt could be disguised by household order. Dona Creusa sat across from Antonio, hands folded, and offered him a look that had both reproach and mercy. When they wheeled Clara into a seclusion room, the air shifted. The hospital corridor talked in the dwindled sounds of monitors. The scene moved into a tense present. Clara lay with her hands pale against the thin sheet. Her breath came in shallow waves. Antonio stood near the window and could not immediately move his feet. He felt as though the ground had become treacherous beneath him. Every step he had taken away from her now offered itself back as accusation. He pressed his hands into his pockets and found the paper folder he had once set aside, now heavier than before, and thought of the way fear had guided him. Do you fear loving again or losing again? The question, which had once been a tool for prying him open, now pounded with the weight of consequence. He had given himself an answer once, hesitation, but here, at the stark edge of potential loss, it demanded a new one. In the hospital's thin air, he learned that choices made from fear can sometimes hurt as much as the tragedies they attempt to prevent. Clara's eyes opened and found him. There was no theater in her look, only the honest everyday shock of someone who had not expected rescue from the man who had once stepped into a burning shed to pull her out. "You should have been here," she whispered, as much reproach as plea. Her voice was a rasp from the last days of shortage and neglect. Antonio took her hand without asking permission. He had been withholding himself as if protection were a virtue. Now his fingers on hers felt less like absolution than a promise he did not yet know how to keep. "I'm here," he said, and the sentence was simple, without the hedges he had long used. The hospital days were a slow, bright pain. He slept in a chair by the window. Dona Creusa brought a blanket and insisted on staying for parts of the night. João came by with baskets of food that hospital rules allowed only in small packages, but the keepers of law looked the other way when João explained the country logic. Clara's recovery was neither instant nor miraculous. She had been depleted not only by the physical strain of trying to hold a life together, but by malnourishment and the stress that had been a slow leak in her well-being. The doctors said simple things: nutrition, rest, a pace. They offered no theology. They suggested, humbly, the regimen of ordinary care. During those days, paperwork arrived from the ledger. A summons, a demand that a debt be settled, and a stack of notices that showed interest accumulating like moss. The presence of paper had not changed. What changed was Antonio's refusal to let paper decide the life in front of him. He negotiated with a humility that surprised him. He called Morel and asked bluntly what could be done. The lawyer, who had opened the folder with measured professional distance weeks earlier, now leaned toward an arrangement that neither man had expected when the papers had first been read. He would use his knowledge to mediate with creditors, to put forward a plan that would not break Clara. He would not erase responsibility, and he would not pretend the ledger lines were nothing. But he would, in the quiet way of a town lawyer who had seen trouble before, create breathing room. Antonio sat in the small hospital room and listened as Clara explained, with the sort of plainness that had grown in her under pressure, why she had kept certain things private. "It was shame," she said simply. "I thought if you knew, you would see me as less. I didn't want my past to stand between me and the work I have done. I needed someone to see me as I was trying to be." Her confession was not theatrical. She did not plead or justify. She offered context. She spoke of nights when she had measured corn by light of a lamp and chosen which letter to open and which to let sit. Of men who had come looking for money, their voices low, their threats the kind that can make a person retreat into silence. She told him of the day after Ricardo disappeared, of the way neighbors moved in with hurried kindness and doubled knives of pity. She explained she had feared not only losing the respect of others, but losing the last fragile piece of dignity she could call her own. She had thought to protect that dignity even if it meant omitting details from forms. In that thin hospital room, the two of them faced what secrets and silence had done to their fragile shared life. Antonio heard her, and felt the sharpness of his own small cowardice. He had used the town's doubts as a shield for his own need to stay safe. He had been given a chance to choose and had chosen the cautious thing. He had protected his hurt rather than the person who had offered to keep it warm with ordinary acts. The admission did not make what had happened less real. It only made it clear that the truth was not as simple as the papers had suggested. There had been shame, and there had been omission, but there had not been the malice Leonor's gossip had implied. When Clara's hand curled around his, the decision he made then felt both inevitable and like a new birth. He told Morels he would help, however he could. They drew up a plan that did not erase debt, but that made payment feasible, modest, incremental, and anchored in the land's productivity rather than in the play of rumor. João offered to take on extra hours in the harvest, and Dona Creusa kept the household accounts more diligently than she ever had, keeping receipts and notes like a ledger of healing. The town watched as a man who had been the subject of a gossip storm became the agent of a practical solution. Forgiveness in those days was not a word flung like a charm. It was a sequence of small acts. Antonio went to the creditors and spoke. He asked for leniency and explained the plan. He did not ask for favors. He asked for time, a request people in small towns often grant when trust has been rebuilt. Clara attended sessions with a nurse who taught her practical ways to keep records and to talk through financial logic without shame. The community responded in patches. Some eyes softened when they saw the cost Clara had absorbed, some still held to suspicion like a comfort. Leonor did not announce repentance, but she found fewer allies in her small campaign. People who had once listened for scandal now watched with cautious curiosity as debts were slowly settled, and as the two people who had been at the center of the story were seen working side by side. Months passed and slow things happened. Clara regained weight, her laugh returned, small and surprised, the henhouse flourished, seedlings sprouted where char had once been. Antonio, who had been a man content with survival, now worked at the business of living with another person. In the shared labor, the old walls of his disuse began to fall, brick by practical brick. He learned to rely on another's steadiness, her way of checking a fence line just so, her habit of straightening a seed row, and found that the reward of symmetry in small tasks had a large effect over time. The clinic with its fluorescent light had been a crucible. It had stripped the choice down to a single element, action or withdrawal. The question the woman had asked in smoke and ash returned, and this time his answer did not wobble. He had feared both loving and losing, but he had learned that in choosing to act, to give aid and to forgive, he did not renounce memory. He honored Laura and Miguel in ways that were visible and invisible, by keeping their rooms, by dropping cuttings from Laura's roses at the new bed, by teaching any child who visited how Miguel had loved to count the beans on a vine. But he also allowed his days to be filled with conversation, with shared plans, with laughter that was not an offense to the past but an expansion. There was a turning point that announced itself in small public ways. At the Harvest Festival that winter, the community gathered in the small hall where paper lanterns hung like suspended stars. The custom was to share the night's labor in the form of food and music. People sat on mismatched chairs and the hum of voices filled the room. João spoke from the stage, joking about a tractor misadventure, and then, without ceremony, he told a small true story about how Clara had taught him a better way to set seedlings, and how Antonio had stepped in to negotiate when the bank came calling. The story was plain and warm. It made the room feel like something that had mended. The applause that followed was not thunderous. It was a practical sound, good and neighborly. Antonio felt, in that moment, the town as a living organism change course. Leonor's whispers, which had once seemed to have a coast, now had the small edges worn down by the daily acts of people who preferred usefulness to gossip. Leonor herself came to the festival with a plate of sweets and a face that sought neither forgiveness nor victory, only the appearance of propriety. Perhaps she liked to be needed. Maybe the act of being right was less important than the social center it gave her. Whatever the reason, the town's balance shifted slowly, not by dramatic denunciation, but by the accrual of ordinary kindness. As the months turned into a year, Antonio and Clara shaped a plan for the land that honored both legacy and the need for practical income. They created a small cooperative for part of the harvest. Antonio's plot would include half the new seedlings Clara had insisted on planting on the burned patch, and when the crop came in, they would sell together, splitting profit into a pot that covered debts and another that went into a rescue fund for neighbors in need. It was a business decision and a moral one. It tied the land they loved to the community they wanted to heal. Dr. Isuba Mirel served as a kind of notary, not because of formality, but because he believed in the potential of a life rebuilt by both hard work and clear agreements. The relationship between them deepened without the fanfare of a sudden confession. They lived into the idea of being a public couple slowly. They shared walks along the rows at dawn, and sometimes in the evenings, over a pot of stew, they would talk about small things, the way rain sounded on certain roofs, how best to fix a fence, what to do when a child's cough would not go away. Antonio found himself telling Clara about Laura, not as an offering of nostalgia, but as the sharing of a story the two of them now carried together. He spoke more of Miguel's games, and allowed her to keep a toy in a basket where any visiting child might find it. An early winter evening, at a community celebration that brought everyone under the low eaves of the town hall, the music soft and the smell of roasted beans in the air, Antonio stood in front of the people who had come to know them. He felt the weight of 8 years, and also the thin, bright potential of what might be. He climbed the small platform and summoned his voice. "I used to think keeping things the same was a way to keep what I loved," he said, simple and direct. "I was wrong. I held them under glass and thought that made them safe. But the people we love, Laura, Miguel, they wanted a rest for us, not a burial place. They would have wanted us to live." He turned to Clara then, and the crowd leaned in, not from curiosity, but because the story had become, for them, their own. "Clara has asked my hands to help," he said. "She has taught me a lot about work, and about courage. I have learned it's braver to trust than to hide." He knelt, there on the small stage, and offered a ring he had hardly thought to make. It was not a show of wealth, merely a band of hammered metal he had had the blacksmith craft. But in the town's light, it glinted like an offering. "Will you marry me?" he asked. The answer was both private and public. She said yes in a voice that carried all the way to the back of the hall. The room erupted not in triumph, but in relief. People who had once whispered grew loud in their blessing. Dona Cruza cried with the unashamed wetness of someone who has seen seasons of sorrow and joy. João shouted, unrefined and genuine, the sort of noise men make when they are pleased. Even Leonor, who had come with a look she could not disguise as congratulation, offered a small smile that was ambiguous but real. They married on a cool morning in the little white chapel up the hill. The ceremony was modest and held the tone of the life they wished to lead. Not a cleansing of the past, but an inclusion of it. Laura's stone sat at the top of the hill, and people placed a sprig of rose on it that morning. Antonio went to the grave before the service and spoke softly, leaving a seed of thanks not as an erasure but as a blessing. I am living, Laura, he said aloud. We keep what was, but we also welcome what is. Years passed. Children came, some of them not born from their bodies but from the flow of neighborhood needs. One morning a child wandered in from the lane with cheeks like warm apples and stayed. Another, years later, was theirs by invisible threads that made family without sharp lines. They taught children how to pick coffee cherries and how to sew a torn sleeve. They told stories of Miguel and encouraged the children to make new games in his honor. The house, which had once been a museum, became full of the useful mess of living. Chalk on the porch floor, a child's drawing on the refrigerator, a second plate on the table. The rosebush outside the kitchen window, Laura's rosebush, bloomed each year, and Clement, a small boy with a mop of unruly hair, would take a petal and press it between the pages of a book, a ritual that kept the past close and alive. Antonio grew older in ways that were visible, lines on his face, hands tougher and a little slower, hair silvering at the temples. He also grew and softened in a way that had more to do with courage than age. He learned practical things, how to read a child's mood, how to navigate a market without being stoic, and less practical things, how to speak when something frightened him, how to ask for help when he could not manage alone. He was not free from sorrow. There were times the house felt heavy, and the absence of what had been before instruction came again. But sorrow and joy had room to coexist, like two songs played on adjacent fields. Leonore's power of gossip dwindled in the face of the new normal. People stopped listening for scandal when bread was to be shared, and when a cooperative's success meant a more stable income for the community, her presence remained. Neighbors do not entirely disappear from the landscape, but her words no longer shape the town's course. She tended her garden and watched the world in a manner softened by age. She spoke to Antonio less often. When she did, it was to ask for a patch of shade or a ride to the market. The cycles of life had their own way of dulling sharp edges. One evening, many years later, Antonio sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and watched the children run between the rows. The sun fell like a generous hand on the hills, and the air smelled of damp earth and the sweet roast of beans. Clara stood in the yard, barefoot, tending to a small plant that had just pushed through the soil. A child called Miguel, after the son he had lost, leapt to meet a cart. Antonio laughed, a sound that had once been rare and special. Now it was part of the household music. He walked to the small white chapel before dusk and stood at Laura's stone. He placed a hand there, and the rosebush behind him sent up a new bloom. He said nothing at first. He allowed the memory to sit beside him like a companion. On the walk back down the hill, he thought of the question that had defined the stretch of his life. Do you fear loving again or losing again? He had lived both answers. He had feared losing, and that fear had once kept him from living. He had feared loving, and that fear had almost made him an accomplice to a slow destruction. But in the end he had chosen to love, with a wary courage that honored the memory of what had gone before, rather than buried it underground like a stone. Choosing to love again had not erased the grief of Laura and Miguel. It had incorporated it into a life that was larger precisely because it had room for both joy and grief. He thought of Dona Creusa's hands, and of João's laughter, and of the way Dr. Morel had used his ledger not to condemn, but to find a path. He thought of Clara's steady hands, and the night she had asked him the question in smoke and ash. He smiled at the memory of that day, and at how a single direct question had pushed him into motion. That night, as stars pricked the sky, the family gathered at the table. There were more chairs now than a lonely man might have filled. The food was simple. The conversation was earnest. Children told a story about a goat that had escaped and ran through the beans. A neighbor asked for advice about a fence. Someone mentioned the coming rain. In the midst of the ordinary, Antonio raised his cup. To those who teach us how to try again, he said, and the people around him echoed the sentiment in their own ways. The room filled with the modest, unshowy gratitude of people who had weathered more than one kind of loss. Honors were private, gratitude was communal. If fear had a shape for him now, it was something different, no longer a truncated shelter, but a reminder. Fear remained, but it had become a companion he acknowledged rather than a jailer. He kept the rooms where the past lived. He tended them with reverence. He allowed new voices into those spaces. He planted rose cuttings in both gardens. He taught children the old tricks Miguel loved, and also taught them to try new ones. In the end, the answer to the question that had opened his life, "Do you fear loving again or losing again?" was not a single slogan, but a practice. It became the habit of showing up, of settling debts not only of money but of trust, of forgiving when confession met action, of negotiating the continuing realities of life with both courage and humility. Antonio's choice to love again had been fragile and deliberate, earned in small, practical ways, and blessed by the townspeople who had chosen to set aside judgment in favor of care. Years later, when grandchildren stamped the dust from their shoes on the porch, and a small hand pressed a flower into his palm, Antonio would sometimes tell the story of the question that had changed him. He told it not as a moralizing parable but as a memory. The day smoke rose into the sky, and a woman with soot on her cheek asked him whether he was afraid of loving or losing. He would watch the listeners' faces, some weathered, some young, and he would say only what he had learned. "Both are real," he would tell them, "but if you find yourself choosing, choose the one that makes room for living." Outside, the coffee trees bent in the evening wind. The house hummed with the sounds of a family who had known grief and chosen to live anyway. The roses by the kitchen window opened like small gladnesses against the dusk. Antonio kept a small place at the table for the memory of Laura, and for any visitor who came from pain. He had learned that the safe thing, keeping the past sealed, was not the only way to honor those he had lost. He had learned that love, given with caution but given nonetheless, could hold the whole complicated mess of life: joy and sorrow, memory and risk, the old and the new. If this story touches you, if the idea of choosing to love despite the fear of loss strikes a chord, consider sharing it with someone who needs courage to take that small risk.